The Roman Empire did not fall in a single dramatic moment. There was no afternoon when the lights went out across Western civilization. No single battle after which Rome was simply gone. There was a process, spanning generations, accelerating across decades, visible to anyone paying careful attention long before the end became irreversible. And at the center of that process was not the failure of Roman armies, or the superiority of the Germanic tribes who eventually occupied the western provinces. At the center was a monetary catastrophe, so thoroughly modern in its structure that it reads less like ancient history than like an economic warning from the future. Rome destroyed itself with its own money, and it did so through a series of decisions, individually rational in the short term, cumulatively catastrophic in the long term, that have been replicated in outline by virtually every major state that has ever faced the same structural pressures. To understand the mechanism, you need to understand what Roman money was and what it meant for the economy it supported. The Roman monetary system at the height of the early empire was centered on the denarius, a silver coin that had served as the primary unit of commercial exchange and government finance for more than 3 centuries. At the beginning of the Augustan era, in the 1st century BC, the denarius contained approximately 95% silver. This high silver content was not merely a matter of material quality. It was the foundation of commercial trust in the monetary system. The denarius was accepted across the entire empire, from the Syrian desert to the Scottish highlands, because everyone who received it could be confident that it contained approximately the same amount of silver as the one they had received before, and that they could therefore exchange it for goods and services at a reasonably predictable rate. This trust was the invisible infrastructure that made the most complex commercial economy the ancient world had ever produced possible. Trade across the empire, grain from Egypt, oil from Spain, wool from Britain, wine from Gaul, manufactured goods from the workshops of Italy, depended on a monetary medium that both parties trusted. The silver in the coin was the guarantee of that trust. The financial pressures that began to erode this foundation accumulated gradually across the first 2 centuries AD. The empire's military budget was enormous, maintaining legions on the Rhine, the Danube, the Euphrates, and the African frontier, with all the logistical infrastructure of supply, pay, and retirement benefits that professional military service required, was the single largest line item in the imperial budget. Administrative costs grew as the bureaucratic complexity required to govern 60 million people across a territory, stretching from Scotland to Mesopotamia, expanded with each generation of governance. The welfare distributions, the grain dole, the public games, the bread and circuses that Roman political culture had made functionally impossible to eliminate, represented a fixed obligation that grew with the population of Rome. The empire's traditional mechanism for managing these costs, the plunder of conquered territories, the tribute extracted from new provinces, the vast quantities of precious metal that military expansion brought into the treasury, was no longer available at the rates that the early empire had produced. By the 2nd century AD, the frontier had effectively stabilized. The empire was no longer expanding. It was defending. And defending a long, expensive frontier is fundamentally less financially productive than expanding through it. The result was a persistent structural gap between what the empire needed to spend and what it could extract through taxation and legitimate revenue. This gap was not immediately ruinous. It could be managed, temporarily, through the reserve surpluses accumulated during the centuries of expansion. But the reserves depleted with use, and the underlying structural gap did not close. The solution that successive emperors reached for, not as a deliberate policy decision, but as a recurring emergency measure, each instance of which made the next one marginally more likely, was debasement. The silver content of the denarius was progressively reduced. More coins could be minted from the same weight of silver. The number of coins in circulation increased. The nominal value of wages and prices could be maintained, while the real cost to the treasury of each payment declined. Under Nero in the 1st century AD, the first significant debasement reduced the silver content of the denarius to approximately 90%. Under Marcus Aurelius in the 2nd century, further military pressures reduced it to approximately 75%. By the time of the Severan dynasty in the early 3rd century, it had fallen to approximately 50%. And then the crisis of the 3rd century, the 50-year period from approximately 235 to 284 AD, in which the empire had more than 50 emperors, each typically elevated by military coup, and each typically murdered by the next, produced a debasement spiral that reduced the silver content of the Antoninianus, the principal coin of the era, to approximately 2 to 5%. The coin was bronze with a thin silver wash. Its face value said one thing. Its material content said something entirely different. The economic consequences were exactly what a basic understanding of monetary theory would predict, and they are documented with remarkable clarity in the contemporary sources that survive from the period. Merchants recognized that the coins they were being paid with contained almost no silver and adjusted their prices accordingly. The price of a measure of wheat, of a length of cloth, of a day's labor, all rose in nominal terms as traders demanded more of the debased coins to receive the same real value they had previously extracted from fewer, purer ones. This was not speculation or profiteering in the modern pejorative sense. It was rational adaptation to a monetary environment in which the unit of exchange was being systematically debased. The price increases were the market's mechanism for maintaining the real value of transactions in the face of nominal debasement. The military, whose members were among the most politically important constituencies in the empire, and who understood perfectly well that the real purchasing power of their nominal pay was declining, demanded compensation. Successive emperors responded by increasing nominal military pay, which required further debasement to finance, which produced further inflation, which produced further demands for pay increases. The cycle was self-reinforcing and accelerating. In the civilian economy, the collapse of monetary trust produced a partial return to barter, particularly in rural areas and for large transactions where the risk of receiving heavily debased coins was most severe. Tax collection became more difficult as the government's own monetary instruments lost credibility. Major landowners began demanding payment in kind, in grain, oil, and other commodities, rather than in coins, whose real value was uncertain. The sophisticated commercial economy that the stable denarius had enabled began to fragment. The regional trading networks that had knitted the empire together, moving agricultural surplus from Egypt and North Africa to feed Rome, moving manufactured goods from Italy and the eastern provinces to the frontier, integrating the production of different regions into a coherent economic whole, depended on monetary trust for their functioning. As that trust eroded, the commercial integration eroded with it. The empire's economic geography began to fragment into more local, less integrated, less productive units, a process that both reflected and accelerated the political fragmentation of the 3rd century. Emperor Diocletian's response in 301 AD, the Edict on Maximum Prices, was a recognition of the problem and a catastrophic misdiagnosis of its cause. The edict imposed official ceilings on hundreds of goods and services across the empire. Charging more than the official maximum was made punishable by death. On paper, this was an attempt to stop the inflation by administrative fiat. In practice, it was an attempt to override the market's information processing mechanism without addressing the monetary conditions that were producing the price signals the market was generating. The results were entirely predictable to anyone familiar with the economics of price controls. Merchants withdrew goods from sale rather than sell at prices that did not cover their costs. Producers reduced output rather than produce at a loss. Shortages emerged and worsened. A black market developed in which goods traded at their actual market prices, underground and outside the reach of the edict's enforcement. The enforcement itself, conducted with the severity that Diocletian's administrative style preferred, produced fear, resentment, and economic disruption without achieving any stabilization of actual prices. The edict's failure is documented in the sources with unusual clarity. Lactantius, writing in the years after Diocletian's reign, described how the merchants withdrew their goods from sale when the edict was issued, and how the resulting shortages made necessities more expensive in real terms than they had been before the edict attempted to make them cheaper. The law that was designed to control prices produced, through the mechanism of market distortion, prices that were effectively higher for consumers who could find the goods at all. The edict was eventually abandoned. The underlying monetary instability was partially addressed by Diocletian's monetary reform, which introduced a new gold coin of higher and more consistent purity. Constantine completed this reform with the solidus, a gold coin whose consistent weight and purity eventually restored monetary trust, at least at the highest levels of commercial and government transactions. The solidus was so successful that it remained the standard monetary unit of the Byzantine Empire for nearly 1,000 years. But these monetary reforms, however technically competent, could not reverse the structural damage that decades of debasement had done to the commercial integration of the Western provinces. The fragmentation of the Western economy, the retreat from complex, long-distance trade to more local, subsistence-oriented production, created conditions in which the Western imperial government could no longer extract the revenues it needed to maintain its military frontier. The military frontier that could no longer be maintained failed to hold. The Germanic peoples who had been held back for centuries by that frontier moved into the administrative vacuum. The Western Roman Empire ended not with a bang, but with the gradual administrative dissolution of structures that had already lost their economic underpinning. The historical mirror to the modern world is not perfect. It never is. Modern monetary systems are vastly more sophisticated than Roman ones. Central banking, fiat currency, bond markets, and the institutional frameworks of modern monetary policy create tools for managing monetary stress that Diocletian could not have imagined. But the structural pattern, the gap between what a major state needs to spend and what it can sustainably collect, filled by monetary expansion that reduces the real value of outstanding obligations, managed through increasingly desperate interventions when the inflationary consequences become politically intolerable, is not a Roman peculiarity. It is a recurring feature of the relationship between political institutions and monetary systems across every era of history. Rome's version is simply the most thoroughly documented ancient instance of a pattern that modern observers have plenty of contemporary material to study. The individual wealth preservation lesson from Rome is not complicated. The Romans who preserved the real value of their assets through the inflationary spiral of the 3rd century were not the ones who held large quantities of debased coins. They were the ones who held real assets, land, productive property, gold, whose value was not denominated in the currency that the state was debasing. The currency debased. The farmland did not. The gold did not. The farmer who owned land in the Italian countryside in the 3rd century was, in real terms, better off relative to the holder of denarii with each cycle of debasement. Not because the land's nominal value necessarily increased, though inflation in nominal prices meant that it likely did, but because the thing he owned maintained its productive capacity and its real exchange value in a way that the monetary instrument did not. Know what holds value when money does not. In Rome's case, the answer was land and gold. The principle is the oldest and most consistently validated one in the history of wealth preservation.